Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Eric Segall back with us today. We'll get to Eric in just a second. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening. And we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media. And we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe. And you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Eric Segall is a constitutional law scholar, professor, and author of the books Originalism as Faith and Supreme Myths, Why the Supreme Court is Not a Court and Its Justices Are Not Judges. His articles on constitutional law have appeared in, among others, the Harvard Law Review Forum, the Stanford Law Review Online, the UCLA Law Review, the George Washington Law Review, the Washington University Law Review, the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Constitutional Law, the Northwestern University Law Review Colloquy, and Constitutional Commentary, among many others. His op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Atlantic, SLATE, Vox, Salon, and the Daily Beast, among others. And his television appearances include CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and France 24. Eric, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you, Andy. The world's changed a bit since I was here last.
It certainly has. So let's start with Donald Trump's crazy cabinet nominations. Which of these concerns you most?
All of them. I don't know. It's really a difficult question. So I worked for the first Bush administration in the Department of Justice. And I worked there as a liberal progressive. Mm-hmm. And despite that, I worked on cases like Iran-Contra and Lockerbie and other pretty high-profile cases. The political people during that administration twice moved off of cases that I said shouldn't be brought. I was a peon, but back then the Department of Justice had this idea that it would do, political things, but in the context of doing the right thing, despite the torture memo, which was awful and terrible. Generally speaking, there was a feeling of we work for the people. He is going to break that. His DOJ directors, the head of DOJ is going to break that. The head of the FBI is going to break that. The relationship between the FBI, DOJ, and the president is my biggest fear, especially in light of the threats this administration is making to the media, to politicians, to academics.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about his nomination to head the FBI, Kash Patel, in a second, but since you mentioned DOJ and Pam Bondi, who he has nominated after Matt Gaetz's nomination failed miserably. Dave Arenberg, who's a Democrat and who worked as a prosecutor under Pam Bondi when she was Florida's Attorney General, he has great respect for her and says she has great respect for the rule of law and essentially gave his thumbs up. And he's a pretty outspoken Democrat. What do you make of that? Does that make you feel any better, given what you just said about the Justice Department?
I don't know. I believe her behavior during Bush versus Gore could use a little bit of examination. But leaving that, I believe. I haven't gone back on that yet. But it's not so much. I mean, Gaetz was never going to get it. It was always a smokescreen. Mm-hmm. I actually thought, I will say this. There were people who the media reported he was considering who would likely be worse than Pam. Okay, so I will concede that point. It still makes me very nervous. I want to go back to the FBI for a second, because that's a big piece of this. People may not remember how powerful J. Edgar Hoover was, and I think for a quarter of a century or more. I mean, and what made him powerful was not that he was director of the FBI. What made him powerful, and I represented the FBI several times, I know what I'm talking about here. The head of the FBI, if that's a position one wants to abuse, can be abused in the worst of ways. So Martin Luther King, of course, was wiretapped and everybody else. But that's with 1960 technology. Now imagine 2025 technology and the FBI being under the head of somebody whose mission was, and this was Hoover, collect secrets on famous people so I can blackmail them, they'll do what I want. I think that is the role model that the incoming, I'm worried about that role model, especially since it lasted for a quarter of a century in this country and did a lot of damage. So I do think technically, and then the head of the FBI, the head and Attorney General and the president all work together when crises occur, 9/11 type crises or other types of crises. I just shudder to think of the people running these organizations. I don't think Pam Bondi has the experience or the, I don't know what I want to call it, to, the substance to be an effective attorney general. But who knows? Maybe she'll surprise.
So let's assume for a second that Patel gets through the confirmation process and becomes head of the FBI. He will, in effect, be working for Pam Bondi.
That's a little unclear, by the way. So technically, yes. I will tell you, there have been generations of people where that is viewed as a working relationship, not a senior. They work together, I think.
Mm-hmm. And at least from what it would seem like on paper, one is just a blatant Trump thug who will do whatever Trump tells him to do, even if it's literally putting someone in a prison cell. I don't get that impression nearly as much from someone like Bondi, although she certainly scares me, given her record as a pretty loyal Trumper. But do you think that she would tolerate the worst impulses of Trump in his quest to weaponize the FBI?
And let me go back and say, I mentioned Bush versus Gore with Pam Bondi. I meant the NFIB litigation.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean, but
okay.
Again, the bottom line is I don't know the answer to your question. From what I've read, heard, and studied, Mr. Patel seems like a much bigger threat than Bondi. There's no question about that. But that's what I was trying to allude to earlier. We had a series of attorney generals when J. Edgar Hoover was FBI director. Those attorney generals were afraid of Hoover. I mean, RFK wasn't. That's famous. That's famous. But Hoover had the power, not the attorney general. That changed eventually, thank goodness, because we don't want it. We want that power to be in the attorney general's office, not the FBI director's office. Mm-hmm. I am nervous that if the AG is moderate and the FBI director is crazy, which would describe many of the Hoover years, we're going to go back to that world. And again, it is the FBI. Sure that the DOJ criminal section has all kinds of abilities to do bad things, but not as bad as the FBI. I mean, the FBI, the potential there is really awful. And
what does that look like within the FBI? Like, what would the greatest risks to Americans' rights be if someone like Kash Patel really went rogue?
Let me talk about a case that I actually had that actually did not. The facts weren't true, but could be true in the future. So I actually represented the FBI in a big case in Cincinnati. 60 Minutes did a story on this, where people alleged that Cincinnati Bell, back in the 90s, in conjunction with the FBI and local law enforcement, bugged the telephones of celebrities, dignitaries, politicians, presidents. Everybody who came to Cincinnati had in hotels, had their phones bugged. Now, it turned out most of those allegations weren't true, but they could have been true. And that's where the risk is. So what the FBI did in the early 60s was it basically wiretapped, followed, and tried to get dirt on civil rights leaders. And believe me, that had a deterrent effect. So I could see this FBI, especially given the statements coming out of the people associated with Donald Trump, they'll start wiretapping and following politicians, media people, anybody on the left who they think is effectively getting in their way. And Andy, this is exactly the playbook of other authoritarian leaders in the world right now. Viktor Orban, this is exactly what he did. He filed defamation suits against the media, as Donald Trump is just doing right now. That's what makes ABC's capitulation so scary. They threatened the media, they threatened academics, they threatened judges, and that is what led to authoritarianism in Viktor Orban. I don't know if that's going to work in America, but that's what they're going to try to do. An FBI director who is willing to go along with that is a very, very, very scary thing, and more scary than the Attorney General. The Attorney General is more public, has more responsiveness to the public than the FBI director, and is easier, frankly, to follow than the FBI director. So I don't know. I also, it fears me, our worst Attorney General, whether it be John Mitchell or whoever, John Mitchell went to jail. He did terrible things, but he wasn't as bad as J. Edgar Hoover. There's just more abuse in that part of the world, and I saw it with my own eyes. Potential for abuse.
Yeah, we're living in a different world where the people in government are literally threatening to imprison those who merely exercise their right of free speech and or do their job as congresspeople.
They're doing it at every level, which is very strange to me. So they're threatening the politicians, all the Biden and all that stuff. They're threatening the media with defamation suits and other things. They're threatening politicians with arrest. They're even threatening little people. I mean, I've been threatened with arrest by someone who claimed he was going to be high up in the just for being a liberal on Twitter. I mean, I'm not making that. I'm not totally worried about it. Although the Wall Street Journal and Politico both talked about it seriously, but they're threatening everybody from powerful people to peons. Mm-hmm. That seems to be their strategy, and that's scary. When they're threatening people like me, with no real, impact.
Well, I guess it depends on how you define they. I'm not delegitimizing your particular threat, but I think you would probably be much more concerned if you were the object of Donald Trump's tweets.
Oh, but I will say academics like me have been threatened by a person named Mike Davis, who was the Article 3 project. Incredibly, he was a Gorsuch crook twice. Mm-hmm. But he has threatened me and other academics with arrest. Some of us responded like, you're kidding, of course. He didn't say he was kidding. So far, he's not received an official position in the Trump DOJ.
And again, just to be perfectly clear, I'm not downplaying the concern. Any threat from anyone ever should be taken seriously about anything, and I'm sure is unsettling.
No, I agree. But forgive me, I'm saying if I was a member of Congress and I wanted to investigate something the Trump administration was doing legitimately, mm-hmm. and the FBI is in the hands of a J. Edgar Hoover type, if that's what he is, with this technology today, I'd be afraid to jaywalk. Like, I'd be afraid to yell at my kids. Mm-hmm. I mean, anything in there. That's what Hoover did. He got the dirtiest things he could find, and if he couldn't find dirt, he would make up dirt and kind of set it. So that's very scary to me.
So you mentioned Viktor Orban and authoritarian regimes like he has in Hungary. When I get into a discussion with friends about this kind of stuff, I revert to my default, which is the courts have pretty much ruled the right way in almost every single case, especially those that are so frivolous. The Supreme Court has done a few questionable things, as you know, but even the Supreme Court a couple of times has been a little surprising in backing up the Constitution. Do you see that changing going into 25, or do you feel pretty confident that the judicial system will still be not just the guardrail, but the dam that holds back this tidal wave of his autocratic whims?
So, Andy, I have to, first, permission to speak freely. Mm-hmm. And second, I don't agree with any of your premises. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court's immunity decision will go down in history as it'll go down as one of the worst decisions in American history. So after last year's term, mm-hmm. I went around the country giving talks saying that that term should have given the entire game away. Right. Because the court rules for abortion rights twice. The court rules against gun rights and delays the Section 3 delays the immunity case, fast tracks the disqualification case. It was all done for one reason and one reason only, to help the Republican Party, mm-hmm. and people should close their eyes to this. So I think they've absolutely got us to this moment. The court's decision not to hear partisan redistricting cases is a big part of what got us to this moment in time. I think that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt went on radio in 1937 and said the Supreme Court of the United States is a threat to our people and our country, and we've got to save the country from the court because it was spoiling his New Deal programs, and the court backed down, he was right and he won. The court was absolutely responsible for the failure of the early New Deal programs. It's not their business to do that. The court is wrong today. The court has absolutely put Donald Trump in power through a various mm-hmm. number of decisions. Having said all of that, I don't know the answer to your question because it depends how serious Donald Trump's threats are. The Supreme Court will never stand up to a president with force, ever. It won't do it. The Supreme Court has no army, no budget, nothing. So if Trump were to come into office and do what he says he's going to do on day one and really act, very much like an authoritarian, I don't think the court will stand up to him. And even if they did, I don't think the president would care. And I say that I got to give a confession on that. I thought that the Supreme Court has gotten so out of control that Biden should have said to them during the student loan decision, when the court struck down the Biden administration student loan decision, I thought Biden should have come out and said, I don't care. I'm not following the decision. It's illegitimate. It's false. We need a president to do that. Of course, most of my colleagues don't like that. Some of my colleagues understand. But what I will say is that's what Donald Trump's going to do anyway. Right. So I do not believe he'll let the Supreme Court stop.
And what about just the lower courts and the appellate courts? And let's take a real live situation, which is the new lawsuit he filed against the Des Moines Register, pollster, and Seltzer. And so the only damages he can claim is that he won, right? Like, so how far can that case possibly go?
Okay. I'm not worried about those lawsuits. That lawsuit is frivolous.
So all his threats, 60 Minutes and Bob Woodward, all that shit, to me, I'm not a lawyer, so I defer to you,
right.
But to me, that's the kind of stuff that gets thrown out with motions.
So, Andy, you have to understand the difference, though. You have to understand the difference. There, in those suits, Donald Trump or his people are asking a judge to do something. Give me damages, give me a lawsuit, give me a victory of defamation, whatever it is. The Supreme Court is not going to let that happen, I don't think. In other words, the court is going to stay strong on its First Amendment. We have the right to criticize public officials. Mm-hmm. If they're going to do, even Justice Thomas, I think, is going to eventually back that. So it's not when he's asking the court to do something that I'm afraid. Is when he's doing something and the court says, no, you can't. That's what I'm afraid of. And what I'm afraid of there is, I just put this person in prison. Now there's a writ of habeas corpus. Now, unless a judge says, let him out, they're not going to let him out. But even if a judge says, okay, I grant the habeas corpus, Hunter Biden gets let out of prison right now, they may not do it. And if they don't do it, the court has no power to make them do it. There's no power. Now, Congress could impeach. Is that going to happen? No. So that's what I'm afraid of. It's not his lawsuits that ask the courts to do things like his defamation.
So it's when he just boldly, defiantly acts like an authoritarian. What's to stop him? You're saying.
And so what Orban did is, before he acted incredibly boldly, he had already replaced the judges who would stand up to him. He had already threatened the academics who would criticize him, and he'd already put media people in jail or threatened them with with defamation suits that would put them out of business. So now, let me just say, Andy, this all sounds very pessimistic. I don't want your audience to leave this. We are pessimistic, I know. But let me just say what one of the smartest people I know said about all this, and I think it makes sense. This guy is an odd person because he is one of the leading philosophers in the world at the University of Chicago. His name is Brian Leiter. And Brian is just, he can talk of philosophy with the most academic of academics, but he is 2 feet on the ground. And that combination is rare, to get someone who's theoretical and on the ground. Mm-hmm. And he wrote something a few months ago before the election where he said, Trump's going to win. Let's accept it. He's going to win. It's over. And then he said, the courts will not save us. Don't expect the courts to save us. And he's right about that. Don't expect the courts to save us. But then he said, what might save us, or likely will save us, is simply our geography and diversity. Hungary is the size of Texas, right? Or something. I don't know. Whatever Hungary is, it's like the size of a state. What does it mean to be an authoritarian in Gary, Indiana, and Anchorage, Alaska, and Honolulu, and Savannah and Atlanta, and what does it mean for thousands of academics to be chilled? And is MSNBC really going to back down? And all that? And California is like a country, so what if California gets really serious about? So I do think that is where we have to put our hope. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court of the United States has failed this country, with the exception of same-sex marriage, has failed this country at every single moment of importance. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to stopping runaway presidents, forget about it. The one time the Supreme Court did stop a runaway president, when they said to President Truman, you can't seize the steel mills during times of war, that was a Democrat president and 9 Democrat justices, I believe, all of whom were friends of the president. They all played poker together. This was not a surprise to the president. The whole thing was kind of a show. When they made Nixon give up the tapes, the Congress was ready to impeach Nixon. So that's how they got rid of Nixon. Mm-hmm. This Congress is not going to want to impeach Trump. And the Roberts Court is very unlikely to stand up to him. But even if they do, I think he's going to ignore them. Again, meaning the people have to save us, which is always the case in America.
And what about the other thing, which I think may save us too, which we're seeing play out right now in Washington with President Musk and Trump's chaos? It's only 6 weeks from the election. It's a month away from inauguration, and already this is the gang that can't shoot straight. So I have what's called the gang that can't shoot straight strategy, and that is, at the end of the day, we won't need the media, we won't need the courts, we won't need voters, we won't need because they are going to self-sabotage. Because if from top to bottom in an administration is unqualified, incompetent, inept, and chaotic, where do they go with that except into the abyss?
That's a great point, and I will take some solace in it, but I will say, I think there's two sides to that coin. Yes, the Musk part of that coin, and Musk and Trump are going to hate each other in 6 months. Like, that's not.
I don't even know if it's going to go that far.
Right. But what I think, again, I try to be, I do a lot of Pete Dominic's show. I think you know Pete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was just on.
I'm Dr. Doom and Gloom to that audience, so I hate to be Dr. Gloom. But I will say there's another side to the coin, the Project 2025 side, the Leonard Leo side, the Heritage and FedSoc side, that is very organized, very smart. They're the ones that came up with a lot of the election strategies. And you combine them with the billionaires who are now supporting Trump for reasons I don't really understand. And what we're looking at is a country that's going to value deregulation beyond imagination, which is going to threaten our food supply and our medicine to a significant degree. And we're looking at anti-female, anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans power, that the money's coming straight from the Vatican and other places. That side of that coin is very efficient. And I think even if we get past the Trump chaos, that side of the coin is going to push civil rights back for a lot of people for a very long time.
But we've seen with Trump when it comes to certain issues where he takes a strong position and then flip-flops, whether it's like in vitro, whatever. Like, we know that Trump is motivated ultimately by being I alone, right? So he could say on a Monday, I believe this. And then on Tuesday, when a lot of people go, we agree, on Wednesday, he's like, well, that means I'm not I alone anymore. So now I got to take the other positions so I can still be alone in this great wisdom. And it's not tied to any core principles or any moral center or any policy positions or anything. It's just the whim of his id. So even when he surrounds himself, and this is just my own, this is like maybe my third hope that I'm hanging my hat on. Yeah. Even when he surrounds himself with people who may be extremely efficient, eventually they're going to clash because he can't work as part of a team or take what he would consider to be orders. The minute someone says, Donald, you have to do this, he doesn't go, oh, well, you know what, I'm paying these people, or they're out to help me, I should listen. All he hears is, I'm no longer the boss. How is this going to make me look? And so these are the things where it's like, it's still the old let Trump be Trump kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a naive libtard.
Well, you're not a naive libtard, but I will say, I told you I worked on Iran-Contra, right? So it's 1989, and I'm looking at President Reagan documents in the National Archives with a criminal law appointee of President Reagan who stayed over during the Bush administration. He thinks I'm a conservative guy because I'm working on this case for the Bush administration. I'm not. And we're in the bottom of the National Archives, and we see it's a beautiful place with like George Washington, Bridles Horse. And anyway, all the Iran-Contra documents were there. There was a photo of Reagan with a monkey from 1940. And the guy turns to me in 1989 or maybe early 1990 and says to me, you know, if I asked Ronnie about the lines in that movie from 1947, he would know every single line. If I asked him about a major foreign policy decision he made 2 years ago, he would have no idea. Reagan had no knowledge of what was happening in his administration for the last year and a half. The people who were doing it were worse than him. I'm not sure who, my point of that story is, I think I'd rather have Donald Trump calling the shots, honestly, than Project 2025. Because I do think Donald Trump has no firm beliefs about abortion and birth control.
Right. And that's my point is that there's never, to me, there's never going to be a scenario where someone else calls the shots.
I don't think you're right about that. What I'm saying is he's 78. I think he's going to be able to be taken advantage of. And unlike the first time he was in office, I think people understand that. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, there's a part of me, his not believing in anything and his complete vacuum of morality is better to me than the Project 2025 people who have a distinct agenda. Sure. Now it's weird. Are we rooting for him to stay strong? Are we rooting for him to be in charge? Like, that's such a bizarre antithetical notion to any semblance of reality I could possibly ever imagine in my life. But I think I'm rooting for Donald Trump over the people who are coming into his administration.
That makes perfect sense for the reason you're stating.
I guess, but that's a scary place to be, not to mention the international implications. What happens when Putin, puts his troops on the Polish border? I mean, Jesus, what are we going to do? I just don't know. I mean, but I will say this. I think your point that his ego is the biggest stumbling block to his terror is correct. point. Let's go with that. I will go with anything optimistic, Andy, at this point, to be honest, because I think...
It's interesting because when guys like you and I sit down and talk, we can't help ourselves from talking within the context of normalcy. And what I've tried to do these past several years is literally get inside his brain. Because if I try to think and rationalize and predict what's going to happen based on my worldview and my experience with boundaries and norms and guardrails, then I get disappointed. But if I try to think like him, like he doesn't think beyond the 5 seconds in front of him.
Can I tell you time from my perspective
Sure.
on this? Because I've been trying to say this since 2016. And there was a time from 2016 to 18, I was on the media a lot, like national media. And I was saying this all the time, and no one believed me. And I don't think people even understood it. Do you believe Michael Jordan is either the best or second best basketball player of all time? Like, pick one. He's either 1, 2, or 3. If someone says he's the 15th best player, we go, well, you're a moron. You don't understand basketball. Frank Sinatra is the greatest crooner of all time, and it's not close. Picasso existed in the world. Da Vinci existed, right? Martin Luther King is as good an orator as we're ever going to have on this planet. You can be as good as him. I don't think you can be better than Martin Luther King as an orator. So generational talents come along. Generational evils come along. Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler are different than other evil people. And what makes Donald Trump a generational threat is a combination of two things. A innate ability to bring out the very worst in people at all times, to find the lowest common denominator, and an inability to be unselfish in a very organic way. This is the example I give. People hate it. If God came to Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley, 2 men I detest with every fiber of my body, and said to them, I'll make you president. I'll make you king. I'll make you tyrant. But 10 million innocent Americans have to die. You won't be held responsible. I'm God. I can do this. But you are responsible for the death of 10 million Americans. I believe in my heart, Harley and Cruz say no. I will not kill 10 million Americans.
Maybe
I believe in my heart,
9.
Donald Trump can't say no to that question. He doesn't have the organic physical ability.
He doesn't have a human organ. I say if you cut Trump open, what you find is the shark from Jaws. You find beer. There's no organs. There's beer cans, small fish, coins.
What we're saying something big. See, people won't accept the bigness of what we're saying. What is stopping him from being Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini are the conditions around him, not anything internal to him. And people, that's overstating. It's not overstating it. He has no ability to do the unselfish thing. None. If he were living in 1934 Germany, he could be Hitler. If he were living in 1938 Italy, he could be Mussolini. Would he kill 10 million Russians? Yes, he would. He can get away with it. But no one really believes that. Not in their heart of heart, right? Do you believe it in your heart of heart?
What we're talking about right now?
Yeah,
absolutely.
He would kill 10 million Americans.
He's an evil genius.
Yes.
And he's a sociopath.
Yes.
And I don't believe he has even one normal human emotion.
Well, that's the other thing someone pointed out to me in a different podcast. So let's take Hitler for a second. Hitler was a painter. Like, he may have been bad at it, but Hitler actually had an interest in art. Like, he had an interest in something. Donald Trump has no interest in anything. There's nothing redeeming. There's not a single redeeming. Wrestling. I like wrestling. He liked wrestling. That's fine. But that's it, right? That's it. Can you name any other thing? And then Celebrity Apprentice, which was just him reading lines off a page and being an actor. He has, and that was just to make money and give him an image. He has no interest in anything.
No, and when I started doing this podcast and I would interview people who worked for him at first, one of the things I would ask is he capable of love? And they all said no.
Of course not.
Imagine Donald Trump loving anything. He doesn't even love himself, which is why we see certain behavior out of him.
You know what? That's, we're playing amateur therapist here and whatever, psychiatrist. I'm not even sure that's true. I think I thought he doesn't love them. I think he thinks he's infallible. I think he thinks his intuition is basically, he'll admit in a rare moment that maybe it's not perfect, but I think he thinks what he thinks is simply what it is. And there's no room for anyone else to say that might not be right. I don't think he hates himself. I think Nixon hated himself. I don't think Trump is anywhere near hating himself.
All right, let me ask you a question. Okay.
Yeah.
He's been elected twice now. I mean, how many presidents have we had in this country now? 47, and he's 2 of them. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a rare gig. He has escaped every single criminal prosecution. He's going to get off scot-free, right? He's still unhappy. He still can't go, wow, that's so cool. I won. He's a sore winner. And what happens when you can't accept success and victory? It's because there's like maggots feeding on your soul if you have a soul. He cannot be happy, which is why he can't just move on, because I think he hates himself no matter what happens. Constantly searching for affirmation, for redemption, for attention. He has crippling insecurities. This is not a man who likes himself.
And I think his inability to tell the truth, his literal physical inability to tell the truth, is probably part of that. He can't let himself see the truth because then he would hate himself even more. So I'll go with that. I want to go back to Brian Leiter, my Chicago. I do hope that people would see how difficult it would be given our federalism. You know, it's interesting. Liberals decried federalism for a very long time. You know, the idea that states and local governments can do better than the national government. And by no means, I'm no means a states' rights person or anything, but I will say it's going to be people like the governor of Georgia, who definitely has presidential ambition. He's definitely going to run for Senate and then probably the president someday. It's right of center politicians in blue places like Atlanta that can stand up to him. They stood up to him last time. That's the only reason, you know, that's what happened last time. Without the governor of Georgia, Arizona, a couple other places, you know, the legislature, it would have been a problem. I don't know what's going to happen next time because of these people's ambition to succeed him. Now, that could be good or that could be bad. My guess is the economy 2 years from now is going to go into a severe, terrible, you know, place. And then that'll end Donald Trump's regime if his authoritarianism doesn't work. That's my prediction. You know, I don't think authoritarianism can work in America. I think we're too big and too diverse. But I don't know. I've never in my life been worried about it until this moment.
But I agree with you, and federalism is important. Consider his threat of mass deportations. Well, he needs state and local authorities to help carry that out. And we've already seen in the past that they don't really want to go along with this kind of stuff. And so I think your point is a really good one about Hungary being the size of Texas or whatever. We have 50 very, you know, we're not a monolithic country in that regard. And we run from deep red to bright blue and everything in between. And the bulk of the country is pretty centrist, although social issues like same-sex marriage and abortion and 3/4 of the country is there on a lot of that stuff. And if you look at the election results, you look at how close, yes, he won all the swing states, but like by a point, 2 points, didn't even break 50% in popular vote, lost seats in the House, and has a very thin majority in the Senate. Not a mandate by any stretch, not a landslide, and a very tenuous position for not just him, but Republicans, as we're seeing right now play out with this shutdown situation. 38 of his own people went against him in Congress.
That's all fair. Well, we don't know, though. I think we agree that Trump and his people are going to push executive power to the limit. By the way, as have all presidents since World War II. This is a question of degree. I mean, Obama did it too, Clinton did it too, but I think, but not on the retribution side, right? It's not. I mean, if Trump came to power simply saying the American people want Project 2025, they made it clear. That's one thing. It's the retribution side. It's the democracy side that is the scary part.
Well, let me ask you about that with Liz Cheney in particular. Aren't people like her and Jamie Raskin and Adam Kinzinger, people who either were in Congress or still in Congress and acting under the umbrella of their responsibilities, aren't they protected by the speech and debate clause?
So James Madison, a much smarter person than I am, when they were debating the Constitution, reminded people that no matter what we decide, no matter what we put in this great document, there are parchment barriers. And what he meant by parchment barriers is without the people believing in them, they mean nothing. So the Russian Constitution of the 1950s was unbelievable. Freedom of this, freedom of that, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. They had no freedom. They had no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of anything. Everything that has protected us in the past from presidential overreach was either came from the courts or the Congress. But it's all on paper. at the end of the day, let's say Trump wants to do X, and even the Republican Congress says, no, we're not going to fund X. We're going to take away your money to do X. And the court says, no, Mr. President, you can't do X. Congress has said, no, you can't do X. If Trump wants to do X, then there's only one issue. There's only one question. There's only one thing. Who will the generals back? And that is a place that America has almost never gotten to before, but could very easily get to again. And neither you nor I or people I've talked to, and I have some connections here, no one knows what the answer to that question is yet, because there's all of this stuff about, loyalty tests for generals and firing some of the old time generals who've been there. But at the end of the day, forget Trump. What I wrote about Biden was he should not obey the Supreme Court decision on student loans. Mm-hmm. If he'd announced that publicly, then Congress would have wanted to impeach him, I think. But again, let's say that happens. Again, he has the military. So if Biden, no one's going to war over student loans. My point is, whoever has the military at the end of the day has control. So having said that, if Trump wants to deport everybody on day one and courts stop that, and Trump says, no, I'm not following the courts, and Congress says, okay, then we're going to impeach you, and Trump says, try it.
But how would he implement the deportations? Because if you're going to need the National Guard or the military or law enforcement, they can disobey the president if the order is to do something illegal.
But then they'll be fired. So that's what happened. So Nixon.
This is a mess. This is chaos. I mean, you're talking about anarchy. I just don't see America getting there. I really don't. Not under this plan.
No. Let me be clear, Andy. Let me be clear. I don't either, for the reasons mostly stated by my friend in Chicago. I just want to say this. So I've been teaching constitutional law for 34 years. I practiced it for 5 years before that. So I'm basically 40 years in the business of studying law, America, politics, and all that, especially my personal views, which that Supreme Court's a political organization doing political things. I never in my life was worried about this Nixon was terrible, and Bush was the second Bush, and a lot of things with Iraq were terrible, and Iran-Contra was terrible, and Watergate. But I've never been afraid to speak publicly. I am currently a little bit afraid to speak.
Well, I get that. I totally get that. A lot of people are.
And that's a really scary thing. As a law professor at LSU, who said, I don't know the context of why he said this, but he basically said to his students, listen, if you voted for Donald Trump because of his policies, I understand. We can disagree about policies. That makes sense. If you voted for him for his policies, but recognize what a terrible, immoral, evil man he is, all I would ask you is when you go out in the world as lawyers, if you want to, I'm not telling you anything about his policies, but don't act like him. Don't be like him. That's all he said. Just don't be like Donald Trump personally. His policies are fine. The governor of Louisiana got involved, said he should be fired, said he should be stripped of tenure. There's going to be an investigation. And all he said was, don't be like Trump personally. In fact, that's the only negative thing he said. That's the world that we find ourselves in. And, we'll see, will MSNBC go to bat for Rachel Maddow if she's taken off TV literally and arrested? Yes, courts will go. Courts will rule for Rachel Maddow. I have no doubt about that. I don't know what Trump does when courts rule for Rachel Maddow. That's what I don't know. Now, hopefully it'll never get that far. This is all bluster. It'll be 4 years of terrible. The Dems will win big in the midterms. You'll now have a nice conversation upon my retirement in 2028, and all is good. Let's go with that. I do think if I was a liberal, I know Jamie Raskin well. When Jamie got cancer the first time, I sat in his office in 2000 and taught his classes. I love Jamie Raskin. I think he's just fantastic in every way. I'm worried for him. I am worried for those people. Jamie will not be threatened. Jamie will not back down. Yes, he has immunity under the Constitution. No, that doesn't matter if people don't recognize that immunity.
Well, you're raising a really good point, and I don't hear a lot of people asking that question. Like, what if he loses on everything and just says, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway? We don't really see anyone in the news talking about that. And that's really when the democracy falls apart, if it falls apart.
Yes, and I'll tell you that conservative law professors, famous ones, like the 5 or 6 that people have heard about, are saying things like, that's why when Segall criticizes the court, like Segall has done for 35 years, it's not a partisan thing for me. It's a dangerous thing because the court are going to be the people to stand in between, to which I say to them, maybe Nixon backed down, but only because he was going to be impeached. If the House is not going to stand behind the court's not going to do anything. So don't be so sure about that. I think, though, at the end of the day, Andy, let's leave on a positive note. Trump's general incompetence is what will save us all. Right? That's all we can hope for, right?
I'm 1,000,000% with you, and hopefully, like you said, we're going to be like smiling, going, "We were right. Let Trump be Trump." But we'll see. Yeah. But you got to come back soon. We'll talk about it after he gets started, and we'll see where we're at.
Thank you, my friend, and happy holidays.
You too. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.